John Miller never thought the people who shared his blood would leave him stranded like a forgotten suitcase. But that's exactly what happened at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport on a gray Thursday morning. The air inside the terminal smelled of coffee and disinfectant, the kind that clings to the back of your throat. And over the loudspeakers, a boarding call for a flight to Orlando echoed. 2 hours earlier, he had been sitting at his kitchen table in rural Ohio, sipping black coffee from his wife Margaret's favorite mug. She'd been gone just 2 months, 45 years of marriage ending in a quiet hospital room. His son Eric and daughter-in-law Melissa had insisted he come with them on a healing trip to Florida, promising sea air, family time, and maybe a chance for him to smile again. They'd even called it a group effort, each of them chipping in for the cost. John had sold his old fishing boat, Margaret's idea, years ago when they thought they might retire by the lake, and handed Melissa the cash without asking questions. At the curbside check-in, Melissa had insisted they handle his bag. "We'll check it with ours, Dad. You just relax," she'd said, sliding the small carry-on from his grasp. Inside, things moved fast. The airline agent scanned his paper ticket, then frowned. "Sir, there's no return flight under your name." John blinked, confused, and turned toward Eric, who was pretending to scroll through his phone. Melissa looked straight at him, lips curling into that kind of smile people wear when they think they're telling you something you should have already known. "We only bought you a one-way ticket. You'll figure the rest out," she said lightly, as if mentioning the weather. "You've got your phone. Sell it if you need bus fare." Eric didn't speak, didn't even look him in the eye, just shifted his sunglasses higher. The two of them stepped into the first-class lane without hesitation, disappearing towards security. John stayed where he was, surrounded by the clatter of rolling suitcases and the smell of pretzels from the food court, clutching his useless itinerary. No luggage, no seat on the return flight. No explanation that made sense. For a moment, he thought of calling someone, his brother in Indiana maybe, but the humiliation rooted him to the spot. He sat on a metal bench, straight-backed, chin lifted, while strangers glanced his way and quickly looked elsewhere. Then, slowly, he reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. Inside was a business card, its edges yellowed with time. Thomas Wade, attorney at law. Years ago, Margaret had told him, "If you ever need anything, you go to Thomas. He'll know what to do." Staring at the card, John felt something shift. Not panic, not yet, but the first stirrings of resolve. They thought they'd left him with nothing. They had no idea where he was headed next. John sat on that cold bench for a full minute before moving, letting the noise of the airport wash over him, letting the sting of what had just happened settle into something sharper. The sting became focus. He pulled out his phone, the same one Melissa had suggested he sell, and found the number he hadn't dialed in over a decade. When Thomas Wade's voice answered, warm but cautious, John didn't bother with greetings. "It's John Miller. I need to change my will," he said. There was silence on the other end, then a steady, "Come to my office right now. Bring your ID. 214 East Main." John stood, slipped the envelope back into his jacket, and walked straight out of the terminal without once glancing toward the gates. Outside, the February air was cold enough to make his eyes water. He raised his hand to hail a cab, and when one pulled up, the driver, a wiry man with a Reds cap, nodded at the address and merged into traffic. As the city rolled past, John thought about the weeks since Margaret's funeral, the casseroles from neighbors, the awkward condolences from people who didn't know what else to say, and the sudden shift in Eric's tone when he'd called about the Florida trip. "It's just for a little change of scenery," Eric had said, Melissa's voice faint in the background. "We'll all pitch in." John had wanted to believe it was kindness. Now he saw it for what it was, calculated convenience. They hadn't brought him along because they missed him. They'd brought him along for what he could give, and when he had nothing left to offer, they'd left him like trash by the curb. The cab pulled into a row of old brick buildings downtown, the kind with faded signs and narrow steps. Thomas Wade's office was on the second floor above a diner that still smelled of frying bacon. The lawyer was waiting at the door, hair grayer than John remembered, but his handshake just as firm. "You look like you've been through hell," Thomas said. John managed a dry smile. "Let's just say I learned something about family today." Inside, the office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. They sat at the same wooden table where, years earlier, John and Margaret had signed their will, certain that leaving everything to Eric was the right choice. Now John leaned forward, hands flat on the table. "I want his name gone. Hers too. Every part of it." Thomas studied him. "That's a big step. Are you sure?" John nodded once. "They left me at the airport with no ticket home. They took my luggage. They made sure I had nothing. That ends today." For the next hour, they went line by line through the old document. The farmhouse in rural Ohio, fully paid off after 30 years, the 3 acres of land behind it, the small investment account John had tended like a garden, the pension he'd guarded carefully since retiring from the plant. Every piece of it would be reassigned. "Who gets it now?" Thomas asked. John thought for only a moment. "The Ohio Veterans Assistance Fund. Housing, legal help, medical aid. They take care of men who've been left behind. I know what that feels like." Thomas's pen moved quickly, scratching new names and removing old ones. The decision felt heavy but clean, like cutting away a rotten limb to save the tree. Outside, a siren wailed faintly, but inside the office there was only the steady rhythm of pen on paper and the low hum of the heater. By the time Thomas slid the new will across the desk for John's signature, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the polished wood. John signed without hesitation, she pressing the pen firmly, each letter of his name deliberate. "Once we file this," Thomas said, "it's final." "That's what I want," John replied. Thomas looked at him a long moment before adding, "This will be a shock to them." John's eyes hardened. "Good, they've shocked me enough for one lifetime." The old will was fed through the shredder, each page disappearing with a sound that reminded John of peeling bark from dead wood. He stood, slipped the folder of new documents under his arm, and thanked Thomas. As he stepped back out into the cold, the wind cut across his face, but for the first time that day, he didn't feel small. He felt like a man who had just taken back control of his life. He didn't know what Eric and Melissa would think when the letter came, and he didn't care. They believed they'd left him with nothing at the gate. They had no idea he'd just left them with less than nothing. 2 weeks after that meeting with Thomas, John woke before dawn to a thin layer of frost on his farmhouse windows, the air inside cold enough to make his breath visible. He had been thinking for days about the next step, turning it over in his mind like a stone in his palm. The will was changed, the legal ties cut, but his life was still tethered to the place where every wall whispered Margaret's absence. The house had been home for 40 years, but now it felt like a waiting room for someone who'd already been called elsewhere. So, he made the decision, quietly, without telling a soul, that he would leave. Not run, not vanish. Just go. He called a moving company from 2 counties over, deliberately avoiding any local business that might gossip. "I'll only need 2 men and a small truck," he told them. "I'm taking just a few things." When the day came, he brewed his coffee, stood at the kitchen counter, and looked around one last time at the worn wood cabinets, the table where he and Margaret had shared thousands of breakfasts, the sink where she'd hummed to herself while washing dishes. The movers arrived promptly at 9. They were polite, quick, and didn't ask questions. John directed them to the items he wanted: Margaret's quilt, folded neatly in the cedar chest, the wedding album with its curling edges, his old fishing rod, and the armchair by the front window that had molded to his shape over decades. Everything else stayed. As they worked, John walked through the rooms alone, touching the backs of chairs, the cool surface of the mantel, the banister polished by years of hands sliding along it. He lingered in the living room, remembering the night of their 40th anniversary when they danced barefoot to an old record, tipsy on cheap champagne, the glow from the fireplace soft against her hair. In the hallway, he stood for a long moment where Margaret had last kissed him goodbye before heading into town. A goodbye he hadn't known was final. The smell of her rose lotion had faded from the air, but in his memory, it was as strong as ever. By the time the last box was loaded, John felt not empty, but settled. He left the keys in a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter with a note written in his firm, steady hand. "Don't call. Don't ask. I am exactly where I want to be." He locked the front door for the last time, the sound of the bolts sliding home sharper than he expected, and climbed into the passenger seat of the moving truck. The drive to Willow Creek Senior Living took less than 2 hours, but it felt like crossing into a different life. When they arrived, the receptionist, a woman in her 50s with warm eyes, looked up from her desk and smiled. "Welcome home, Mr. Miller," she said, and John realized that was the first time in months anyone had said those words to him without a trace of obligation. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh flowers, sunlight streaming through wide windows onto comfortable chairs arranged in small clusters. Residents chatted over puzzles and coffee. Someone laughed loudly from the dining hall. His new apartment was a corner unit with a view of the courtyard, modest but filled with light. The movers placed his armchair near the window as he'd requested, and on the small table beside it, John set down Margaret's photo in its simple wooden frame. In the kitchen, a welcome basket waited. Crackers, jam, and a handwritten note from the director. "Thank you for helping us make this place possible. Now it's yours too." John smiled faintly, knowing the truth behind those words. The sizable donation he'd arranged through the Ohio Veterans Assistance Fund had helped the facility expand a wing for retired service members, and part of his estate would ensure its upkeep long after he was gone. Eric and Melissa would never know that. Never set foot in the apartment or touch the walls of a place that welcomed him more in one day than they had in years. That first evening, he joined a small group in the dining room for roast chicken and green beans, introducing himself to a retired history teacher named Helen, who made him laugh before dessert. Later, he walked the courtyard alone, listening to the rustle of bare branches in the winter wind, the glow of lights from other residents' windows casting a warm pattern on the snow. He breathed in deeply, feeling a kind of peace he hadn't known was possible so soon after leaving everything behind. He thought of Eric and Melissa somewhere in Florida, likely drinking wine by the pool, believing their father was sitting in an empty house waiting for a call that would never come. They had no idea that the man they left at the airport had stepped into a new life, one where his name was spoken with kindness, where no one sighed when he entered a room, where every seat at the table was an invitation instead of a grudging obligation. In the quiet of his new room, John poured himself a cup of tea and sat in the armchair, the photo of Margaret catching the lamplight. "I'm okay," he told her softly. And for the first time in months, he meant it. 6 months passed quietly at Willow Creek, the kind of quiet John had learned to trust. Not the sharp silence of an empty house, but the gentle hum of a place alive with routine. He had joined the woodworking club, taken up Tai Chi in the mornings, and even started leading a weekly letter-writing group, helping other residents reconnect with old friends or estranged family. He was no longer the man left standing at the airport. He was Mr. Miller. The one people waved to when he crossed the courtyard, the one Helen saved a seat for in the dining hall. But beneath the surface of this new life, he had been waiting for a date circled in red on the small calendar tucked inside his wardrobe. It was the day Thomas promised the letters would be delivered, copies of his updated will sent to Eric and Melissa by certified mail. When the morning came, John didn't feel nervous. He felt steady. By late morning, Thomas's email arrived, letters delivered as of 9 a.m. John closed the laptop without replying. He knew the reaction wouldn't take long. By noon, his phone began to buzz on the nightstand, Eric's name flashing again and again, 16 calls in one day. No voicemails, just the impatient, repeated ringing of someone who had never been told no and meant it. That evening, an email arrived. "I'm sorry, Dad, but can we at least keep the land behind the house? The kids planted a garden there." John read the words slowly, once, then twice. He could almost hear Eric's voice, the same tone he used as a boy when asking for something after knowing he'd crossed a line. But this wasn't about a broken window or a missed curfew. This was about the life John had built, the trust they had shattered. He pictured the garden, Melissa's sacred space she had posted about online, never once mentioning him, never inviting him to join. He thought about how the land was already earmarked for the Ohio Veterans Assistance Fund's therapeutic horticulture program, where veterans struggling with memory loss would work the soil, plant vegetables, and watch something grow again in their own hands. That garden would belong to them now, not to Eric, not to Melissa, not to people who left him at an airport with no ticket and no shame. He closed the email without answering. That night, he walked the courtyard, the early spring air carrying the faint scent of fresh earth from the flower beds the residents had started planting. He paused under a budding maple tree, looking up at the first pale leaves against the evening sky, and felt the same quiet certainty he'd felt in Thomas's office months before. Inside, Helen was reading in the lounge and waved him over, but he shook his head gently. Tonight, he needed the solitude. Back in his room, he lit the small candle he kept beside Margaret's photo, the same one he lit when he needed to think. "They thought I'd fall apart," he told her softly. "They thought I'd beg to be let back in, but they're the ones who lost something that day." He thought about the letter in Eric's inbox, the frozen accounts, the closed door of his future inheritance. He knew they'd talk about him, twist the story, tell the grandkids whatever version suited them. But the truth wasn't theirs to control. It was his, and it was written now in black ink on legal paper, locked in Thomas's safe. For the first time in decades, John didn't feel like someone waiting for approval or forgiveness. He felt like a man who had already given himself both. He blew out the candle, pulled the curtains open wide, and let the moonlight spill across the floor. Somewhere beyond that glow, his son was pacing, his daughter-in-law was fuming, and neither of them had the faintest idea that their absence had made room for something far better. And John wasn't about to tell them. Weeks passed after Eric's email, and John kept his phone turned off more often than on, letting the silence stand as his answer. The calls slowed, then stopped. At Willow Creek, life moved forward in a way that made the past feel like a separate lifetime. He spent mornings in the sunlit library with a crossword or a novel. Afternoons tending the small vegetable patch he and Helen had claimed in the courtyard. The tomatoes were just beginning to flower, and the sight of them gave him a satisfaction that went deeper than he could explain. One Thursday evening, after the woodworking club wrapped up, a fellow resident named Ruth, sharp-tongued but soft-hearted, sat beside him on the porch. She studied him for a long moment before asking, "Do you ever regret it?" She didn't have to explain what "it" meant. John looked out at the courtyard where the setting sun turned the windows gold. "Only that I didn't do it sooner," he said. Ruth nodded and didn't press further. Later that night, alone in his apartment, John took out Margaret's photo and set it on the table beside a fresh cup of tea. He thought about the man he'd been the morning Eric and Melissa left him at the airport, stunned, humiliated, holding a useless itinerary and no way home. That man had believed family was something you kept, no matter how much it hurt. Now he understood that family was something you also had the right to walk away from when they stopped walking with you. He thought of the veterans who would one day live and work on his old land, planting gardens of their own, finding peace in the soil the way he had in these quiet months. That was his legacy now. Not a house filled with echoes, not a savings account waiting for hands that had already let him go, but a living thing that would grow without them. He imagined the look on Eric's face when he learned the land had been turned into a sanctuary, not a backyard for Melissa's curated life. And yet there was no gloating in him, only a firm calm that came from knowing the decision was right. Near midnight, he opened his journal and wrote a single line. "Some things are inherited, others are earned, and some, like peace, you make yourself." He closed the book, turned out the light, and lay back in bed, the hum of the building around him a comfort instead of a void. Down the hall, someone laughed. Outside, the fountain in the courtyard kept its steady trickle. John closed his eyes, thinking about the men who would sit by that fountain in years to come, and how they'd have no idea the ground they were on had once been fought over in emails and phone calls he never answered. That was the best part. They wouldn't need to know. They'd simply live there, grow there, heal there. And as sleep came, John realized that in choosing to be forgotten by those who took him for granted, he had made himself unforgettable to those who would matter most.